Okay, video 2.2. Here we're going to talk about some of the vocabulary that's used a lot when we're starting up algebra. Okay, these are terms we're going to hear over and over as you start to work some of these problems that involve variables. Now you have your guided note sheet in front of you. Should say 2.2 if you're on this video. Dissecting algebraic expressions. So we're getting into more detail here. First, let's talk about algebra. Algebra, we touched on the definition in the beginning of the year really quickly. Algebra is a kind of mathematics. It's just a kind of mathematics. There are multiple types of math, as you'll learn, whether it's geometry, trigonometry, analysis, calculus. Algebra is just one of those kinds of mathematics, if we can make it really simple. It's a kind of mathematics where symbols are used to represent numbers. As I'm doing these notes, pause the video if you need extra time to write this down. I'm going to keep going. So let's talk about the definitions you need to know. Important definitions for today. The first one says letters or symbols used to represent blank are called blank. We just mentioned this. Letters or symbols used to represent numbers are called variables. Alright? There's our first really important vocabulary word, a variable. Variables could be any letter. X is a common variable. Y could be a variable. T could be a variable. Even symbols could be a variable. This box could be a variable. This circle could be a variable. Any of those shapes, symbols, letters could all be used as variables. They just mean that there's some number out there represented by that letter or that shape, and we don't know what that number is. That's a variable. So then, an algebraic expression, which is what this whole lesson is about, an algebraic expression then is a combination of those variables and two other things. It could have variables, coefficients, and constants. An algebraic expression is a combination of variables, coefficients, and constants. Pause the video to make sure you have that down. We're going to go over what each of those means. I'm actually going to add one more thing. Operations. We've talked about those when we talked about the order of operations, obviously, but operations, plus, minus, times, divided by, are a very big part of our expressions as well, okay? So, for example, what's one example of an algebraic expression? How about 5x plus 6, okay? Everything we talked about is represented in this, and I'm going to go over in more detail what each of these parts are. This is an algebraic expression. An algebraic expression, you can tell it's an expression because there's no equals sign here. It just says 5x plus 6. There's no equals sign. Alternatively, we could have an equation. Now the difference between an expression and an equation is this. If I were to say 5x plus 6, that's an expression. If I were to say 5x plus 6 equals 0, that is an equation. We're going to get into more detail about this, but these are our two types of series of numbers that we'll see: expressions and equations. You can remember equations because they have an equal sign and expressions don't. equation for this equal sign here. Okay, so those are two types that are important to remember. Now, back to these notes. So a constant then, what is a constant? A constant is the number in an algebraic expression that is by itself. So up here, the constant is 6. It's not attached to any variable, it's just on its own. 6 is the constant. What do you call a constant that does not stand alone? That would be the coefficient. Now the coefficient was 5x. 5x was the coefficient. And it makes sense because coefficient, let's break it down. Co is a prefix meaning together. If co means together, we can say that this 5 is put together with the variable, the x next to it. In other words, a coefficient is a number that is together with the variable. And then finally, if we have 5x, what exactly does that mean? We've seen this before with parentheses. Anytime you have a number right next to a parentheses or a number right next to a variable, that means you're multiplying. So the coefficient is a number multiplied by the variable. When a variable is by itself, there is still a coefficient multiplying the variable. Alright? Last important point. For example, if this just said x instead of 5x, if it just said x, that doesn't mean 0x. That doesn't mean there's no coefficient there. It means 1x. Because the coefficient is a number multiplied by the variable, so it makes sense that there's actually a 1 here. Because 1 times x is still going to be x. 1 times any number is just that same number. So if you see a variable by itself, whether it's x or y or t or p, it's always the same thing as saying 1x or 1y. Okay? So quick review, we talked about expressions, equations, variables, constants, and coefficients.